Fine, let's start. Number 1. Argoland. Off the northwestern coast of Australia, the seafloor carries a scar. Geologists call it the Argo Abyssal Plain, and for decades it presented a strange kind of crime scene. The shape of the ocean floor told an unmistakable story. A continent had once been attached here, and then it had pulled away and left. The direction was clear. The timing was clear. The only thing missing was the continent itself. A landmass the size of a small subcontinent had simply vanished from the map, and nobody could say where it had gone. The fragment is called Argoland, named for that abyssal scar, and it rifted away from Australia around 155 million years ago in the late Jurassic. The problem that haunted researchers was simple. When a continent breaks off and drifts, it should turn up somewhere, the way Zealandia or India eventually did. Argoland did not. It seemed to have dissolved into thin air. The answer came in 2023. A team at Utrecht University, led by Eldert Advocaat and Douwe van Hinsbergen, published their reconstruction in the journal Gondwana Research after roughly 7 years of work. What they found explained the disappearance. Argoland had not survived as one coherent block. It had been torn into thin ribbons, shredded into a scatter of fragments. Advocaat coined a word for what it became, an archipelago, a drowned and broken archipelago rather than a single coast. Those fragments are not gone. They are buried today beneath Southeast Asia, hidden under Myanmar, under Indonesia, under the islands east of Sumatra. To find them, the team used plate tectonic restoration, winding the motion of the plates backward in time and matching the ages and chemistry of rocks scattered across the region. Argoland had traveled roughly 5,000 kilometers north over more than 100 million years, all of it tied to the slow breakup of the supercontinent Gondwana. The magnetic striping frozen into the Argo Abyssal Plain dated the spreading that pushed it away. And the journey mattered, because Argoland may have carried its cargo of plants and animals north, helping shape the sharp biological boundary known as Wallace's Line that still divides Asian and Australian wildlife. Mainstream geology sees patient tectonic stretching. Popular writers reach for sunken continent drama. The sober truth is stranger. A continent can disappear not by drowning, but by being ripped to pieces. And if one can shatter and hide, what about a continent that was buried whole? Number 2. Greater Adria. Picture a continent roughly the size of Greenland. Now picture millions of tourists walking across its corpse every summer without the faintest idea. That continent is Greater Adria, sometimes called Adria or Greater Apulia, and the only piece still recognizable at the surface lies under the Adriatic Sea and the heel of Italy. The rest of it is gone, in the most literal sense possible. It was swallowed by the planet. Greater Adria split from Gondwana around 240 million years ago. The reconstruction that finally pieced its story together was led by Douwe van Hinsbergen of Utrecht University and published in Gondwana Research in September of 2019. It took more than a decade because the work meant synthesizing the tangled geology of the entire Mediterranean region into a single coherent history. After it broke away, Greater Adria drifted north and sank into a shallow tropical sea. There it sat for ages, accumulating thick layers of limestone on its submerged back. Then, around 100 to 120 million years ago, it began to collide with southern Europe. And in that collision, the continent met its end. It was subducted, driven down into the mantle beneath Europe like a sheet of material on a conveyor belt running into the floor. As it descended, its upper layers were scraped off. Those scrapings did not vanish. They were crumpled upward into mountains. The remnants of Greater Adria now form pieces of the Apennines, the Alps, the Balkans, the mountains of Greece and Turkey, and many Mediterranean islands. The limestone that capped the lost continent is the same stone tourists admire across Italy and the Balkan coast. The bulk of the continent, though, went deeper, pushed as far as 1,500 kilometers down into the mantle, where it can still be detected today. The detection method is seismic tomography, which uses the waves from earthquakes to image structures far below the surface, the way a medical scan images the body. Van Hinsbergen's team relied on software called G-plates, and they had to track rocks across more than 30 countries, each with its own geological naming conventions in one of the most deformed regions on Earth. That is why it took so long. The boundaries of exactly how great Greater Adria was remain debated. But the headline holds. Southern Europe's bedrock is the wreckage of a lost continent. That one needed a continental crash to reveal it. The next was betrayed by a single crystal. Number 3. Mauritia. Some continents do not announce themselves with mountains. They leave a fingerprint, and the fingerprint here was a crystal that had no business existing where it was found. The continent is called Mauritia, a Precambrian fragment thought to lie beneath the Indian Ocean and the island of Mauritius, and the entire case for it rests on minerals older than almost anything around them. Mauritius, the volcanic island, is young. It formed from the Reunion hotspot only about 8 to 9 million years ago, which in geological terms is practically yesterday. So when a study led by Trond Torsvik of the University of Oslo, published in 2013, reported grains of zircon in the island's beach sand dated to between roughly 660 million and nearly 2 billion years old, something was deeply wrong. The sand was sitting on rock far too young to have produced those crystals. Zircon is the key witness, because it is extraordinarily durable. It survives weathering, it resists melting, and it locks in a reliable age through uranium-lead radiometric dating. An ancient continental zircon sitting under a young oceanic island can mean only one thing. There is old continental crust buried below. Skeptics had an obvious objection. The grains could have blown in on the wind or slipped into the lab as contamination. That objection was answered in 2017 when a follow-up study led by Louis Ashwell of the University of the Witwatersrand reported a zircon up to roughly 3 billion years old locked inside Mauritian trachyte rock. A crystal sealed inside the bedrock cannot be windblown. Ashwell's team named the buried fragment Mauritia. The likeliest explanation is that it is a splinter left behind when India tore away from Madagascar around 85 million years ago. As India drifted northeast, slivers of continental crust were stranded, then drowned, then blanketed under fresh volcanic rock up to about 10 kilometers thick. Gravity field measurements over the region support the idea, showing crust thicker than ordinary ocean floor exactly where Mauritia is proposed. The same Reunion hotspot that built Mauritius also produced the colossal Deccan Traps in India around 66 million years ago, so this is a region soaked in deep volcanic history. Mauritia appears to be just one of several drowned continental fragments scattered across the western Indian Ocean. It is also, awkwardly, in the same ocean where mythmakers later placed a fictional sunken land. We will come back to that confusion. For now, hold the image. A continent revealed not by its shape, but by crystals older than the seafloor that hid it. The next continent was forgotten so completely it was only named a few years ago. Number 4. Balcanatolia. There was once a doorway between worlds, an island continent that decided which animals would come to live in Europe, and almost nobody had heard of it until 2022. Its name is Balcanatolia, a blend of the Balkans and Anatolia, because that is the ground it once occupied, in the region between modern Europe, Africa, and Asia about 40 million years ago. The landmass was formally named and described in a review study led by Alexis Licht and Grégoire Mété, published in the journal Earth Science Reviews. What they reconstructed was a distinct biogeographic province, a land with its own peculiar fauna, isolated for much of the Eocene by the surrounding Tethys and Paratethys seas. It was, in effect, a giant island with its own evolutionary experiment running on it, separate from the continents on every side. Then the geography shifted. Around 40 to 34 million years ago, Falling sea levels and tectonic movement built land bridges connecting Balcanatolia to Asia. And once the bridge existed, the invasion began. Asian mammals poured onto Balcanatolia, and from there, they pushed westward into Western Europe. This produced one of the most famous turnovers in the fossil record, an event called the Grande Coupure, the Great Break, around 34 million years ago, when Europe's old endemic mammals were abruptly replaced by Asian newcomers. Balcanatolia is argued to be the stepping stone that made it happen, the staging ground that funneled the migration into Europe. The evidence comes from fossils in Turkey and the Balkans showing Asian affinities that predate the Grande Coupure itself, hinting that the newcomers passed through this lost land first. Assembling the picture took decades of paleontological and geological data because the province's shape kept changing as the Tethys and Paratethys seas advanced and retreated across it. Today, Balcanatolia is broken up and folded into southeastern Europe and Turkey. There is no coastline you can point to. Mainstream researchers treat it as a stepping stone migration route, though the exact timing and the precise routes of the bridges are still debated. What makes it remarkable is how unfamous it is. Atlantis is a household word. Balcanatolia, a genuine lost continent that helped stock Europe with its mammals, is known to almost no one. And it carries a humbling lesson. Even relatively recent geography, only tens of millions of years old, can be erased from memory entirely by plate motion and shifting seas. That one drowned and broke apart. The next is still down there, and it was once covered in forest. Number 5. The Kerguelen Plateau. 2 kilometers beneath the cold southern Indian Ocean lies a drowned land roughly 3 times the size of Japan. It once held forests. It once stood in the open air. And it is now one of the largest sunken features of its kind anywhere on the planet. This is the Kerguelen Plateau, a vast submerged microcontinent and large igneous province stretching about 2,200 kilometers across the far south. The plateau was built by the Kerguelen hotspot beginning around 130 million years ago, a sustained outpouring of volcanic rock on an enormous scale. Today, most of it sits 1 to 2 kilometers below the surface, but it did not always. The proof came from the seafloor itself. During the ocean drilling program, Leg 183, around 1998 and 1999, scientists pulled up cores from deep within the plateau. What those cores contained was startling. Fragments of wood, seeds, spores, pollen. That plant material tells of a Cretaceous world of conifers and ferns, a flora typical of the old Gondwanan supercontinent. It means parts of the Kerguelen Plateau were emergent, standing above sea level at various times in the Cretaceous, covered in vegetation. Geologists describe it as a lost continent because mixed in with all that volcanic rock are genuine fragments of continental crust, incorporated as Gondwana broke apart and India, Australia, and Antarctica went their separate ways. The same Kerguelen hotspot is linked to volcanic provinces, now found in India and Australia, a reminder of how far the wreckage of these events is scattered. Of the entire plateau, only the Kerguelen Islands and Heard Island still break the surface, the surviving peaks of a sunken world. The Kerguelen Islands are a remote French sub-Antarctic territory, among the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. The plateau drowned slowly. As the volcanism waned and the crust cooled, it contracted and subsided, sinking beneath the waves over millions of years. The sediment cores record the whole descent, a clean transition from terrestrial deposits to shallow marine to deep marine, layer by layer. Some geologists argue about whether to call it a true microcontinent or simply a giant volcanic plateau, and that debate is genuine. But the central image is not in doubt. There are fossilized forests down there, sealed under kilometers of frigid ocean. Those 5 were real lands, drowned, shattered, or buried by the machinery of the planet. Now we cross a line into the continents that never existed at all, the ones that lived only on maps. Number 6. Hyperborea. For the first half of this list, the continents were real and the maps missed them. Now, everything flips. Here are the continents the maps insisted on, drawn with confidence and detail, that were never there at all. We begin at the top of the world, with Hyperborea. Hyperborea started as Greek myth, a land beyond the north wind, beyond Boreas himself. Ancient writers like Herodotus and Pindar describe the Hyperboreans as a blessed people living in eternal spring, far to the north, associated with the god Apollo, who was said to spend his winters among them. For centuries, it was simply a story. Then, during the Renaissance, mapmakers did something remarkable. They took the myth and drew it as a real Arctic continent. The most famous version belongs to Gerardus Mercator on his map of the Arctic, the Septentrionalium Terrarum Descriptio, published in 1595. It shows the North Pole as a single great black rock, the Rupes Nigra, surrounded by 4 enormous islands, separated by powerful rivers or currents that flow inward toward the center. Mercator drew on older sources, including a now-lost travelogue called the Inventio Fortunata, attributed to a 14th century friar. The black polar rock was not decoration, it was an explanation. Mariners had long puzzled over why compass needles always point north, and the answer drawn here was a giant magnetic mountain at the pole, pulling every needle toward it. The Rupes Nigra was even given dimensions in some accounts, described as around 33 French miles across. The 4-island arrangement came partly from sailors' hearsay about lands in the far north. This was not idle fantasy. It was a serious attempt to reconcile compass behavior, navigation, and classical geography into a single picture, and it produced one of the earliest dedicated maps of the Arctic. The cartographic continent persisted for decades, copied and recopied, before exploration finally proved there was nothing there. The North Pole is not land at all. It is a deep ocean basin covered by drifting sea ice, with no continent beneath it. Mainstream history treats Mercator's Arctic as reasoned fiction, a logical guess that happened to be wrong. Folklore treats it as classical myth made literal, and a fringe tradition still circulates a spiritual Hyperborea, a lost esoteric homeland that later fed polar continent and hollow earth ideas. The North had its phantom continent. The South had one too, and that one stayed on the maps for 2,000 years. Number 7. Terra Australis Incognita. The longest-lived imaginary continent in history was not invented from a single map or a single myth. It was deduced. Its name is Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, and it stayed on the world's maps for roughly 2,000 years on the strength of pure logic, with not a shred of evidence behind it. The reasoning went back to antiquity. Thinkers in the tradition of Aristotle and later Ptolemy argued that a great landmass in the northern hemisphere needed a great landmass in the south to balance it, to keep the globe symmetrical and stable. It was an argument from elegance rather than observation, and it was powerful enough to last. Ptolemy's geography shaped medieval and Renaissance mapmakers, and from the 15th through the 18th century, maps routinely showed an enormous southern continent sprawling across the entire bottom of the globe. Cartographers gave it shape. Oronsfinet, in 1531, drew elaborate coastlines for Terra Australis, often connecting it to the southern tip of South America and Tierra del Fuego. The continent was given mountains, place names, and a geography it never possessed. And because the maps showed it, explorers were sent to find it, expedition after expedition, on the belief that it held rich lands and unknown peoples ready for trade or conquest. The myth began to crack against real voyages. Abel Tasman, sailing between 1642 and 1644, mapped parts of Australia and New Zealand, but found no giant continent. Then, James Cook, on his voyages especially between 1772 and 1775, sailed deep into the Southern Ocean, crossed the Antarctic Circle, and circumnavigated the globe at high southern latitudes. He found ocean and ice, and not the sprawling fertile land the maps promised. The phantom shrank. The real Antarctica was not sighted until 1820 by Russian, British, and American expeditions in close succession, and it turned out to be far smaller and far more southerly than the imagined Terra Australis. The name Australia itself descends from this long tradition of the southern land. Here is what makes Terra Australis different from Hyperborea. It was not wholly false. A southern continent did exist. The map makers were simply right for the wrong reasons, and wrong about almost every detail. Mainstream history calls it a hypothesis hardened into cartographic fact. A fringe tradition points to old charts and claims pre-modern mapping of an ice-free Antarctica. Those phantoms grew from logic. The next continent grew from misread tablets. Number 8. Mu. Some lost continents are drowned. Some are deduced. And some are simply manufactured, built out of mistranslation, and documents nobody can produce. Mu, the supposed lost continent of the Pacific, is the clearest example of the third kind. The name began with Augustus Le Plongeon, a 19th century antiquarian who studied Maya ruins. Le Plongeon claimed to translate Maya codices as describing a sunken land, which he conflated with Atlantis, and he drew in particular on the Troano Codex, part of what is now called the Madrid Codex. His translation was later shown to be entirely erroneous, but the idea outlived the error. It was picked up and massively expanded by James Churchward in the 1920s and 30s. Churchward published The Lost Continent of Mu in 1926, followed by several sequels, and his claims were vast. Mu, he wrote, had been a Pacific motherland, home to an advanced civilization of 64 million people, the source of all later cultures. His evidence was a set of ancient Knuckle tablets he said were shown to him by a priest in India. No such tablets have ever been produced, examined, or verified by anyone else. They exist only in Churchward's account. He claimed Mu was destroyed when underground gas chambers collapsed, dropping the entire continent beneath the Pacific in a single catastrophe, and he tied real Pacific ruins to it, including Non Madol on Pohnpei and the Moai statues of Easter Island. Modern geology closes the case firmly. Plate tectonics shows there is no sunken continent in the Pacific. The floor of the Pacific is young oceanic crust, exactly the opposite of the old, thick continental crust you would need for a drowned landmass. The Pacific is, geologically, the least likely place on Earth to hide a lost continent. Mu is regarded as pseudoscience and pseudohistory, and Le Plongeon's mistranslations were thoroughly debunked once the Maya script was genuinely deciphered in the 20th century. Yet Mu refuses to die. It parallels and borrows heavily from both Atlantis and Lemuria, and its framing of lost tablets and decoded maps ties it directly to the dream of secret ancient cartography. It became a staple of theosophy, occultism, and later New Age and ancient astronaut literature, and it still appears across fiction, games, and fringe speculation. Mu is a continent assembled from misread codices and tablets no one can find. The next continent is more troubling, because it did not start as fiction. It started as real science. Number 9. Lemuria. The strangest story on this list is not the continent that was faked. It is the one that began as a sober, testable scientific hypothesis, and then escaped the laboratory to become a mystical legend. That continent is Lemuria. It started in 1864 with a genuine puzzle. The English zoologist Philip Lutley Sclater was trying to explain a biological oddity. Lemurs and their relatives were found scattered across Madagascar, India, and parts of Africa, lands separated by wide oceans. How could one group of animals end up spread across all of them? Sclater proposed a sunken land bridge, a former landmass that had once connected these regions and since disappeared beneath the sea. He named it Lemuria, after the lemurs, and published the idea in an article called The Mammals of Madagascar in the Quarterly Journal of Science. This was respectable science for its time. The theory of continental drift did not yet exist, so vanished land bridges were a standard, reasonable tool for explaining why the same species turned up on distant shores. Other serious figures embraced it. The biologist Ernst Haeckel went further, suggesting Lemuria might be the cradle of humankind itself, the lost homeland where humans first evolved, a candidate for the so-called missing link. Then the ground shifted under the whole idea. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912, and by the 1960s, plate tectonics had confirmed it. Suddenly, the lemur puzzle had a better answer. The animals were spread across those lands because the lands themselves had once been joined in Gondwana and had drifted apart, carrying their cargo with them. No sunken bridge was required, and indeed, no geological evidence for Sclater's Indian Ocean continent was ever found. But by then, the name had been adopted by people with very different aims. The occultist Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement seized on Lemuria, and in her 1888 work, The Secret Doctrine, she described it as the home of a root race of ancient humans, giant and spiritually significant beings. American esoteric traditions later linked Lemuria to Mount Shasta in California. It became merged with Atlantis and Mu in popular culture, and the Tamil tradition of a sunken land called Kumari Kandam, south of India, became associated with it as well. Lemuria is the cautionary tale of this whole subject. A falsifiable hypothesis, once superseded, mutated into a legend that outlived the science completely. Every continent on this list, real or imagined, echoes one original, and that original is the last name on the list. Number 10. Atlantis. Every lost continent ever drawn, dreamed, or debated traces back to a single source, a story told by one philosopher nearly 2,500 years ago. Atlantis is the original, the template that Mu and the mystical Lemuria and 100 other legends quietly copy. Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, who described it in two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 before the Common Era. In the story, the tale is passed down from the Athenian statesman Solon, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests, and it places the destruction of Atlantis about 9,000 years before Solon's own time, which works out to roughly 11,600 years ago. Atlantis was described as a great island power lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, laid out in concentric rings of land and water around a central temple to Poseidon. According to Plato, Atlantis grew arrogant and warlike, and so it was punished. In a single day and night of misfortune, the island was struck by earthquakes and floods and sank beneath the sea. Most classical scholars read this not as history, but as philosophical allegory, a parable about hubris and the contrast between an ideal state and a corrupt one, and the physical evidence agrees with the scholars. The floor of the Atlantic is thoroughly mapped, and there is no drowned continent there of the scale or age Plato described. Researchers who suspect a real kernel tend to point elsewhere, to the Mediterranean. The leading candidate is the Minoan civilization and the catastrophic eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 before the Common Era, which devastated a sophisticated Bronze Age culture and could have seeded the memory of a vanished island power. Other proposed sites range across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and even Antarctica, none of them confirmed. The legend's reach is enormous. The Atlantic Ocean itself takes its name from Atlantis and the Titan Atlas. After centuries of medieval neglect, the story was revived in the Renaissance, and then supercharged in 1882 by Ignatius Donnelly's book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, which argued Atlantis had been a real, advanced civilization that seeded every culture that followed. That single book launched the modern movement to treat Atlantis as fact. 10 continents, and 2 very different ways to be lost. So what truly separates the real from the imagined? Step back, and the 10 names sort cleanly into 2 piles. On one side sit Argoland, Greater Adria, Mauritia, Balcanatolia, and the Kerguelen Plateau, every one of them a genuine landmass confirmed by physical evidence. On the other side sit Hyperborea, Terra Australis, Lemuria, and Atlantis, every one of them a product of the human mind drawn onto a map. The line between the two piles is the whole point of this story. Real lost continents disappear through the machinery of plate tectonics. They rift apart, like Argoland. They are subducted and buried, like Greater Adria. They are stranded and drowned and capped by lava, like Mauritia. They subside beneath the sea, like Kerguelen, or they are broken and folded into other lands, like Balcanatolia. In every case, the planet itself did the hiding, and the planet left a trail. Imaginary continents appear by a completely different process. They show up whenever humans face an unknown space and fill it with reasoning, with symmetry, with hearsay, or with hope. Hyperborea filled the blank Arctic. Terra Australis filled the blank South. Mu and Lemuria filled the blank oceans, where strange ruins and scattered animals seem to demand an explanation. The confusion between the two piles persists because both produce the same haunting image, a sunken land beneath the waves, and old charts recorded both kinds side by side, the genuine coastline next to the pure invention, with no warning label between them. What separates them now is method. Zircon dating exposed Mauritia. Seismic tomography mapped Greater Adria. Ocean drilling raised the drowned forests of Kerguelen. These tools can tell a real continent from a wished-for one, and the irony they reveal is delicious. The real lost continents are stranger than the invented ones. Nobody dreaming up a myth would have imagined a continent shredded into ribbons and stuffed under Indonesia, or one detectable only through crystals 3 billion years old. The danger comes when fringe writers borrow the credibility of the real discoveries to prop up the myths, conflating Mauritia with Lemuria simply because they share an ocean. And it is worth saying plainly. The phrase maps older than civilization is mostly metaphor. True human maps are only a few thousand years old. The genuinely ancient maps are not drawn in ink at all. They are written in rock, and we are only now learning to read them. That raises a question worth sitting with. Why did intelligent, careful people draw lands that were simply not there? The answer begins with a basic feature of map making. A blank space on a chart is intolerable, both to the eye and to the customer, and so cartographers filled their gaps however they could. Their first resource was classical authority. For centuries, the works of Ptolemy and Aristotle were treated as something close to scripture, and a conclusion that flowed from them carried enormous weight. The symmetry argument that conjured Terra Australis was exactly this kind of inheritance, a deduction from ancient principle rather than from any voyage. Their second resource was hearsay, the half-remembered reports of sailors and the contents of lost travelogues like the Inventio Fortunata that stood behind Mercator's Hyperborea. Their third resource was the misreading of real phenomena, like the compass needle that became a giant magnetic mountain at the pole. Then there was the simple force of habit. Mapmakers copied their predecessors, and in copying, they reproduced the same errors for generation after generation, each repetition making the phantom look more established. On top of that sat commercial and political pressure. A map that promised rich, undiscovered southern lands was a map that justified expeditions and investments, so there was every incentive to keep Terra Australis on the page. What slowly erased these inventions was not better reasoning, but better evidence, the patient work of exploration. Tasman sailed where the giant continent should have been and found open water. Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle and circled the far south, shrinking the phantom to nothing. The sightings of the real Antarctica in 1820 replaced an imagined continent with a real one. It is striking that some inventions, like Terra Australis, held a kernel of truth, while others, like Hyperborea, had none at all. The shift from myth-filled maps to survey-based cartography is one of the quiet revolutions in human knowledge, and we should not feel too superior, because we still map our unknowns with models today, sketching the surfaces of exoplanets and the contours of the deep seafloor from indirect data, trusting that later evidence will correct us. The difference is that we now have tools sharp enough to find the continents that are genuinely hidden. Those tools are why the last 15 years have been a kind of golden age for lost continents. A discovery that would have been impossible in any earlier era has become almost routine, because geology now has instruments that can see through oceans and into the mantle. The foundation is plate tectonic restoration, the technique of winding plate motion backward in time, often using software like G-plates, to ask where a given piece of crust used to be. Layered on top of that are more specialized methods, each suited to a different kind of hidden land. Seismic tomography uses earthquake waves to image slabs of subducted continent deep in the mantle, which is how Greater Adria was traced 1,500 kilometers down. Uranium lead dating of zircon crystals exposes buried continental crust beneath young volcanic islands, which is how Mauritia was caught. Ocean drilling pulls physical cores from the seafloor, raising the wood and pollen and seeds that prove the Kerguelen Plateau once stood in the open air. Other tools round out the kit. Magnetic striping frozen into the ocean floor dates the spreading of basins and reveals where a continent tore away, as at the Argo Abyssal Plain. Gravity field mapping detects crust thicker than ordinary ocean floor, flagging continental fragments hidden below. And old-fashioned fossil correlation, matching mammal species across regions, is what reconstructed the migration route through Balcanatolia. The same family of methods also revealed Zealandia, the famous drowned eighth continent beneath the southwest Pacific, a landmass nearly the size of Australia that is more than 90% underwater. These discoveries have forced a useful vocabulary on us. A microcontinent, a continental fragment, and a large igneous province are not the same thing, and the debates over how to classify places like Kerguelen are real scientific arguments, not hair-splitting. But the overall lesson is humbling and clear. The surface of the earth is a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped clean and written over again and again, with the ghosts of vanished lands still legible underneath if you have the right eyes. Which leads to the obvious question. Beyond the thrill of discovery, why should any of this matter to us now? It matters more than it first appears, in ways both practical and deep. Start with life. Lost continents are not trivia. They are the hidden cause behind patterns we see in the living world today. The sharp divide of Wallace's line, separating Asian and Australian animals, traces partly to the drift of fragments like Argoland. The scattered distribution of lemurs that puzzled Sclater is explained by the breakup of Gondwana that his imagined Lemuria was invented to replace. To understand modern biogeography, you have to know which continents used to be where. Then there is the ground beneath our economies. Buried continental fragments and the reconstruction of ancient supercontinents guide the search for minerals and resources, because knowing where a piece of crust originated tells prospectors what it might contain. Large igneous provinces, like the Kerguelen Plateau, are tied to episodes of dramatic climate upheaval in the deep past, and studying them helps us understand how massive volcanism can reshape the atmosphere. Understanding subduction, the very process that destroyed Greater Adria, feeds directly into the science of earthquakes and volcanoes that threaten people living above those zones today. There is also a cultural reason, and it should not be dismissed. The lost continents of the imagination, Atlantis and Mu, and the mystical Lemuria, are among the most durable stories our species has ever told, and they keep returning in fiction, film, and belief. Part of the work of science is to enjoy those stories while still defending the real discoveries from being hijacked by them, keeping the line between evidence and imagination bright and visible. That defense is itself a kind of education, teaching people how we know what we know. And finally, there is perspective. The deepest lesson of the lost continents is that today's map is also temporary. The continents we live on are not permanent fixtures. They are a passing arrangement in a story of constant motion, and geologists already model the supercontinents of the future, sometimes called Pangea Ultima or Amasia, that will assemble hundreds of millions of years from now. Somewhere out there, perhaps under our own feet, are continental fragments that have not yet been found, which brings us, at the end, to what all of this really says about the planet we stand on. The Earth keeps no clean record of itself. It is the most unreliable narrator imaginable, constantly overwriting its own past, dragging continents down into the mantle and pushing their scraped-off skins back up as mountains, drowning forests, and lifting seabeds into cliffs. Nothing on the surface is final. Everything is in the middle of being erased or rewritten, and the lost continents are simply the chapters we have managed to recover. Against that backdrop, human maps look touchingly small. Our oldest charts capture only the last few thousand years of a story 4.5 billion years long. The phantom continents, Hyperborea and Terra Australis, and the rest end up revealing as much about us as the real ones reveal about the planet. Our compulsion to fill the unknown, to refuse a blank space, is the very same impulse that drew a magnetic mountain at the pole and that drove a Utrecht team to spend 7 years hunting a continent that had shattered into ribbons. The instinct that produced the myths also produced the science. And here is the quiet vindication. The real lost continents prove that the old feeling was right all along. The world really is bigger and stranger than the map. There really were vanished lands beneath the sea. The mapmakers simply guessed the wrong ones, in the wrong places, for the wrong reasons, and it took zircon crystals and earthquake waves and cores of drowned wood to find the true ones. Science turned out to be the better myth, stranger than the legends, verifiable where they were not, and still unfinished. So the next time you stand on solid bedrock, consider what it might once have been. A tropical sea that hardened into the stone of Italy. A drowned forest now 2 kilometers under the Southern Ocean. A ribbon of a continent that traveled 5,000 kilometers to die under Indonesia. 10 names and 2 kinds of lost, the lands the planet hid, and the lands we invented. The countdown ends, but the search does not, because the most honest thing we can say is this. The next sunken continent may be waiting directly beneath you, and we simply have not learned to read it yet.